Now, may I ask the chair of the first session to turn on his mic and video. I'm really pleased now to hand you over to Professor Morten Hviid, a longtime CCP member, my predecessor as CCP director and professor at the School of Law, who will run the first session on new thinking on the theory and evaluation of consumer policy. Morten, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Sean, and welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to be at the summer conference again. We have in this session 3 speakers, Oren Bar-Gill, Paul Heidhues, and David Laibson, and a discussant, Kate Collyer. And I will not do much further in terms of introduction because I think the time is better spent discussing and listening to the speakers. So without further ado, I will hand over to Oren Bar-Gill from Harvard University, Harvard Law School. We'll be talking about manipulation by Mislaid priorities. So Oren, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Morten. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about this joint project with Omri Ben Shahar from the University of Chicago. Let me start with a quick preview. And we're all, or many people are worried about manipulation, and specifically about manipulation in consumer markets. But the first question, though, is what is manipulation? In the literature, manipulation is often defined as the exploitation of irrationality and bias. In this study, we want to look at a different type of manipulation. We call this manipulation by mislaid priorities, and we define this as the prioritization of information in a way that conflicts with its recipient's interests. By the way, we're assuming no line, that the law can catch lies. So why does priority matter? Priority matters when complexity and multidimensionality of products and services prevent consumers from learning all the relevant information. We think that this is very common. It is common when consumers are rational. We know that a rational consumer will acquire information as long as the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. And in this context, prioritizing information X means reducing the relative cost of acquiring X. It is also, of course, relevant when consumers are imperfectly rational. And for example, when they look at salient information. In this context, prioritization or prioritizing X would mean increasing the salience of X. So for both cost and salience, both of these are influenced by the mode, place, time, or context of presentation, and all of these together we will call priority. To be a little bit more specific, consider the following motivating example. Think of a food product that has several dimensions. It can have high versus low fat, high versus low sugar content, maybe GMO, genetically modified ingredients or not. And the question there is, how will these attributes, quality attributes, be presented? Now, they could be presented equally in the same place, the same font, same time, but it is also quite common that the seller will want to highlight, prioritize the good things about the product, say non-GMO, and remain silent about other dimensions or present them in a less salient way. Now, if it is more important for consumers to know that the product has high sugar content, but the seller chooses to prioritize non-GMO information, we will be calling this manipulation. The final thing that I will say within this preview, and I intend this to be somewhat provocative, is that disclosure regulation or mandated disclosures can themselves be manipulative. The basic or the baseline for our kind of thinking or analysis here is that consumers have limited attention or capacity for processing information. And so a disclosure mandate that prioritizes certain information, okay, will displace other information that the seller would otherwise voluntarily prioritize or provide. And so the mandate will help consumers only if the legally mandated information is more important to consumers than the displaced information. One of the main contributions of this study, as we see it, is to show what kind of information is more or less important in different scenarios, and thus hopefully provide some guidance to policymakers as they design disclosure mandates. I'm actually not going to spend the little time that I have and then kind of dive into the literature, but I do want to kind of emphasize one point. Obviously, this work is closely related to large economic literature and asymmetric information in consumer markets. But it's important for me to emphasize that we're not trying to prove or add to the proof that consumers are imperfectly informed. We take this as a given in many consumer markets, and our goal is to study the implications of this informational asymmetry. So diving now into the analysis, we use a very simple setup. Consider a product or service that have two quality dimensions, and each one of these dimensions can be either high or low. And we assume that consumers will read only or review only one of these dimensions or information about one dimension, but they will draw rational inferences about the other dimension. Okay, so this assumption of rationality and built-in inference kind of takes us away from kind of a lot of the literature on manipulation. Now, just to be clear, I'm sure it's kind of weird to think about consumers who can't even read or review information about only two dimensions. So the way I want you to think about this kind of modeling technique is that when I say that consumers can review information about 1 out of 2 dimensions, I want you to think about consumers reviewing 5 out of 15 dimensions. Okay, so within our simple framework, we basically have 2 dimensions and each one has high or low quality. So we have 4 types of products: the high-high product, high-low, low-high, and low-low products. So we will normalize, we'll think about kind of the utility from the low-low project is 0, the utility from the high-high project is 1, the utility that consumers get from these products or services. And in between the intermediate products, HL and LH, there's some utility X, which is between 0 and 1. In the basic model, we'll assume that these 2 intermediate products are symmetric, have the same utility. We'll relax that later. I want to emphasize or focus on a distinction between 2 main kind of polar cases. The first case is the case where the quality dimensions are complemented captures by kind of a low X in our framework. And what you see here in this complements case, that a low quality in any dimension destroys most of the value. Okay, you need to have high on both to get significant value here. What this means is that in this complements case, it is more important for buyers to get the bad news, the low information, and it's less useful for them to get information that there is a high quality dimension. It doesn't tell them very much, okay, because you can have high or high-low, and the differences in utility between these is great. Okay, so this is a situation where consumers care more about learning the bad news about the product or service. Now, there are many examples in the real world where the quality dimensions can be thought of as complements in this sense. So think about a vacation in a resort. If the food is crappy or the service is subpar or the amenities are disappointing, kind of low on either one of these dimensions will kind of destroy your enjoyment of the vacation. Or think about a printer. If it jams often or the ink prices are really high or the wireless connection is spotty, okay, then low on either one of these, again, will destroy much of the utility from the product. Okay, so within this category of complements, what do we see? We see that sellers want to disclose, the good stuff. The sellers always want to disclose the good stuff, the high quality dimensions. Here we see that buyers want to know the low quality dimensions. They care more about low. And so the interests of buyers and sellers conflict. And so according to our understanding or definition of manipulation, sellers that prioritize high, okay, in this context, they're being manipulative. And here there is room for legal intervention, for a disclosure mandate that requires sellers to prioritize the low information, the bad information. This will be helpful for consumers. I want to shift now to the other polar case where the quality dimensions are substitutes. Okay, and here in our framework, this is captured by a high X. In the substitutes category, the presence of high on any quality dimension guarantees most of the value. So here it is more important for consumers to learn good information, to learn high. It is less useful for them to learn low. If they know that there is a low dimension, they can't distinguish between low and low-high, for example, and the difference between those are great. Okay, so high information is more important for consumers in this category. Again, it's easy to think of examples of markets or kind of services and products where the dimensions are substitutes. This usually happens with respect to products and services that have more features than a buyer has capacity to enjoy. So consider a restaurant with 15 main course menu items. Okay, it's enough that 4 or 5 are high quality. They don't all have to be high quality for the consumer to enjoy the restaurant experience. Or think about Netflix. Not all shows have to be high quality for the consumer to get significant value out of this, out of the streaming service. Now, looking at this category, the substitutes category, sellers, as always, want to emphasize, prioritize, disclose high. But here, buyers also want to know high information. That's more important to them. Okay, here the buyers and sellers' interests coincide. And now when the seller prioritizes high, it is not manipulative. This is a situation where legal intervention is not needed. A regime of caveat emptor, free market, sellers say whatever you want, is the better regime. Indeed, if the regulator here steps in and mandates the disclosure of low, of the bad information, this is going to harm consumers. And we will, can even call it manipulative. And so when we here say, no, don't disclose, don't require the disclosure of bad information in this category of cases, we're actually going against the grain of a lot of literature in consumer protection, which kind of pushes these types of disclosure mandates in a kind of maybe less discriminatory way. Now, these are the two main cases. Of course, in the paper, we go into a more general analysis of the distortions under both the caveat emptor regime and the warning regime and some other regimes. I don't want to go into it unless it comes up in the Q&A. But what we try to do here is map in kind of in a plane of kind of that X parameter and also the price of the product, the regions where warning is better and the regions where caveat emptor is better, again, in order to hopefully provide some guidance to regulators. Let me quickly run through a few extensions. The basic model assumed that the two intermediate products, the HL and LH, generate the same utility. They're symmetric, but obviously there are many products and services where there is a primary dimension that contributes more to utility and a secondary dimension that contributes less. The main insight here is that when we move to asymmetric dimension, this allows for interdimensional prioritization on top of the high versus low prioritization that we've seen in the basic model. And this reduces the asymmetric information problem and helps consumers. So for example, under caveat emptor, more information will be inferred. Specifically, if the buyer observes high, a voluntarily disclosed high on the secondary dimension, the buyer will infer that this seller has low on the primary dimension. Otherwise, the seller would have preferred to emphasize, prioritize the disclosure on the primary dimension. When we move on to the warning regime, mandated disclosure, here it makes sense for the regulators to require prioritization of low on the primary dimension, if indeed there is low quality on that dimension. So again, buyers can infer more things. If a buyer observes low on the secondary dimension, the buyer will then be able to infer under this regime that the primary dimension is high. So asymmetric dimensions mitigate the asymmetric information problem. And thinking about manipulation and harm to consumers, they reduce such concern under caveat emptor. The second extension that I want to mention quickly has to do with endogenous quality. So far, we've just taken the quality combinations, HH, LH, HL, and so forth as exogenous, but of course, sellers invest in quality. And so the question is, how would these two regimes, caveat emptor and a warning regime, how would they affect incentives to invest in quality? So starting with caveat emptor, first, we know that under this regime, the seller will be free to say high when there are two high dimensions and when there is one high dimension. This means that buyers won't be able to distinguish between the high product and the high-low or low-high product. And this, of course, suggests that a seller that already has high on one dimension won't have an incentive to increase the quality on the second dimension. Okay, and as a result, there won't be any high products, and this is particularly harmful to consumers in the complements case, where high generates much more utility than anything else. Moving on to the warning regime, we have a symmetric problem here because the law requires a disclosure of bad information of low. Then buyers won't be able to distinguish between low and the intermediate HL and LH product. This means that if I'm an LL seller, I won't have an incentive to invest in improving quality in one dimension. I might try to leapfrog to HH, but that also might be very costly or expensive. And so what happens here is that we won't see the intermediate products. Okay, and so buyers would either be stuck with low, or they'll be forced to pay a lot of money for HH. And this is particularly troubling and harmful to consumers in the substitutes case, where consumers get substantial utility from the intermediate products. The final extension that I'll just briefly mention here is our attempt to endogenize the number of dimensions. And so the results that I'll just telegraph here, and I'm happy to discuss at Q&A if it's of interest, are the following. We show that under a caveat emptor regime, the free market regime, low quality sellers will have socially excessive incentives to add dimensions to their products, dimensions that maybe should not be added. And on the other hand, under a warning regime, the high quality sellers will have socially insufficient incentives to add socially valuable dimensions to their product. Let me just kind of finish with a few concluding remarks. First, a few words on rationality and manipulation. We have shown in this paper that consumers can be manipulated, even when they are perfectly rational. So manipulation can occur even if you know that you are being manipulated. Now, of course, if consumers are not perfectly rational, if they don't draw these rational Bayesian inferences about the unreviewed or undisclosed dimension, then things are going to be worse. The harm to consumers is going to be greater, but it's going to be greater both under caveat emptor and greater under the warning regime. The other thing that I wanted to kind of mention, or another thing that I wanted to mention in these concluding remarks, is the issue of complex prices. So our focus has been, and my focus in this presentation has been on multidimensional quality dimensions when the price is simple, single dimensional. But there are also obviously cases and markets where price is complex and multidimensional, and the same type of analysis can be applied to these markets as well. Another remark has to do with scores and ratings. Think of restaurant hygiene ratings or the APR in consumer credit. These scores and ratings, their purpose is to aggregate information across multiple dimensions. And so in some situations, in some contexts, they might reduce or mitigate the asymmetric information problem that underlies our analysis. Now, we acknowledge, of course, that ratings and scores can be helpful and useful in many contexts, but they are not perfect, and they're not always perfect. And the reason is that it's not always clear how we're supposed to aggregate quality dimensions on very different aspects of the product. Okay, and so when this aggregation is more difficult, our analysis becomes even more important. And I'll say on top of this, even if we want to generate useful ratings and scores, our analysis can be helpful to the extent that the relationship between the quality dimensions, for example, complements versus substitutes, is really important in the design of optimal informative scores. Another quick remark about market solutions. So I'm just going to flag this here. Obviously, there are many things that can happen in the market that might mitigate the underlying asymmetric information problem. And we are all for these market solutions. It's great to the extent that you can mitigate the problem. But again, going back to my initial comment, one of my earlier comments, our goal is to analyze the implications of asymmetric information, given an assumption, which we think is quite innocuous, that there is asymmetric information in many consumer markets, even after these market solutions have done their good work. Another remark has to do with the tiers of priority. In more complex, realistic markets with more complicated products and services, we can have higher level clusters of attributes that are complements, whereas at the lower level, within cluster, the attributes can be substitutes, or it can work in the other way around. Okay, at the higher level, we can have clusters of attributes that are substitutes, And at the lower level within cluster, we will have complementarity between the attributes. And so the approach that we use here can be applied or extended to provide guidance to regulators as they design disclosure rules for even these more complex scenarios. And the final word before I end has to do with buyer heterogeneity. And so, our model assumes that buyers are homogeneous because we want to focus on some other stuff, but obviously buyers are not homogeneous. They're heterogeneous. They could be heterogeneous on multiple dimensions. And there are kind of standard policy responses to these types of heterogeneity, and that's why we haven't focused them here, but just wanted to let you know that we are aware that buyers can be heterogeneous, and with this, I'll subside and look forward to the comments and discussion.
Thank you very much. That's really, really nice, really interesting presentation. We will, of course, as Sean said, we will have questions later on. So do put any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we will come to that at the end of the discussant's remark. So you have to hang around for a little bit. The next speaker is Paul Heidhues. So Paul, please, the floor is yours. Paul will talk about procrastination markets, something I'm sure we all know about.
Okay, I think you can see and hear me, and hopefully you see the slides. So I'm going to talk about procrastination markets. And okay, if I'm still fighting a little bit with Zoom. Now it goes. Okay, so in many markets, there's many markets that we think of or call switching markets. And this is markets in which competition works or is meant to work by consumers switching to better options. So for example, you have a credit card, you have this card for a while. If the deal isn't good, then we want you to switch to a better option. Or you have an energy contract, and the contract expires, and if you're on a bad contract, then we want you to switch to a better option, and through that we want to sustain competition. And when you talk about these markets, then there's sort of two problems of regulatory concern that always come up. And so the number one concern, or the first concern, is consumer inertia. And so the way we model this consumer inertia in economics typically is we think of it as switching costs, right? These are sort of high costs of switching from your current supplier to a new supplier. But in practice, these switching costs seem to be too large to be explained by a rational model. So part of them must be what the early literature calls psychological switching costs. So to give you an example, Ben Handel has this famous paper on the US health insurance market where he estimates that the switching costs would have to be $2,000 US to explain why people don't switch their health insurance contract. And that just seems too high. And this is a, maybe a somewhat extreme example, but in market after market, and we discuss this in the paper, there's evidence that these switching costs are just too high to be plausibly explained by actual classical switching costs. And so we think of these as psychological switching costs. And the second phenomena is high prices. Now, even, and there's high prices in these markets, even when conditions are seemingly ideal for competition. So for example, this was discussed in the US credit card industry of the 80s, when credit cards were still fairly simple products. They had a fairly standardized yearly fee, and competition was mainly in the interest rate. And yet, despite having 300 firms, there were, high prices. Now, you might think that, consumer inertia implies these high prices, right? But that's not true. At least if you follow classical I/O models, then what really should happen is competition should shift to the beginning rather than being eliminated, right? And so this is sort of sometimes called invest and harvest. If customers are really reluctant to switch, then you'd invest a lot into attracting them and give them a really attractive deal upfront or at the beginning, right? And so invest and harvest, bargain or rip-off, or I think in the UK typically it's called the waterbed effect. So it's so ingrained into our thinking, there's lots of colloquial terms for it, okay? And so what I'll do now is I'll propose a simple model that tries to give a unified explanation for both of these phenomena. And the key ingredient of this model is the idea that consumers procrastinate, right? So they repeatedly put off valuable tasks. And there's a large literature in behavioral economics that thinks about procrastination. And so all we do in this paper is try to bring that literature to actual switching markets. Again, so let me jump right into the model, and I'll try to give you a broad idea of how the model works. And so in the model, there's a consumer, and the consumer needs the service. And she needs the service from time 0 to some time capital T. And so at some time -1, prior to she needs the service, she'll choose some initial contract, and that initial contract has some price P-1. And then she has K opportunities to switch as time goes by. Those are equally spaced between 0 and T, or there's always a constant wait time until the next offer comes, and then you let the clock run out after the last switching opportunity. And at every switching opportunity, you can switch to some price. That's, if it's switching opportunity 0, you switch to P0. If it's switching opportunity K, you switch to PK. And the clue is that we model this consumer who procrastinates. And so in the basic model, it's going to be a naive present bias consumer. So present bias consumer overweights current switching costs relative to future costs. Okay, and so the future cost is any switching cost in the future or the monetary costs that come with the contract. So psychologically, the consumer sort of thinks of having to do the hassle of switching right now as current cost, and all payments and all switching that takes place otherwise as future costs. Okay, but importantly, this consumer is incorrect in forecasting her future behavior, so she thinks she will not be present biased in the future, and so she'll follow through plans that she now thinks are attractive. Now in the paper, I formalize this right now with naive present bias. In the paper, we give a reinterpretation in our setting of overconfidence about future memory or underestimating future switching costs, which are alternative explanations for procrastination in the behavior literature. And sort of the mechanism works very similar. Okay, so this consumer, who is this naive present bias procrastinator, now in the market interacts with firms. And so there's at least 2 or more firms. And these firms have marginal costs of 0. And they choose price pairs. And so each firm chooses initial price and a switching price. Okay, and the prices are non-negative, and the initial offer is capped at some maximum price you can set. So think of an essential service. Typically, there's a maximum price people can set, then let's call that V. Okay, and so, the fact that there's a different price for the initial consumer and for switching, this is sort of both somewhat realistic, right? So there's a large discussion, for example, in the UK on the loyalty penalty. That is, if you don't become active, you pay much higher prices. And it facilitates the model, and we'll endogenize it at the very end, maybe, if I have time. So out of these firms, NI firms are randomly chosen to make the initial offer. So that's the amount of offers the consumer thinks about when she first thinks about contracting the service. And the switching offer of the other firms are then randomly allocated to the switching opportunities. Okay, so you can think of each switching opportunity, one of these prices is randomly drawn. And this wait time between offers, right? So we think of this as determined by the number of firms. If there's many firms, you get offers more frequently, and the marketing intensity of firms. So in the credit card industry, you could think about how often you get a letter in the mail that offers you a new credit card. And we solve for symmetric pure strategy Nash equilibria with the firms correctly predicting the consumer's behavior. Now, let me start the analysis, and I'll try and give you a flair for how the market equilibrium works. And let me start by assuming that you only see one initial offer. So now, by assumption, you don't have initial competition. So it's not quite so exciting, but this is going to help build intuition. So suppose you see one initial offer and that there's a lot of competitive firms, or you get switching offers fairly frequently. Then the equilibrium has the form that all firms charge some initial price PI star and make competitive switching offers. Okay. And how is this initial price determined, the equilibrium price? It's determined by the incentive to procrastinate condition. So basically what you do as a firm is you induce the consumer to think she'll switch, right? So you'll try to charge a fairly high price. The consumer knows this is not attractive, so she thinks she wants to switch, okay? But she doesn't want to switch now. She wants to switch next time. Okay, so she wants to procrastinate. And that implies that you get something that we call the competition paradox. The more marketing or the more firms you have in the market, the more intense future competition or potential future competition, the higher the initial switching price. And so basically, if you have more options to switch, there's a lower cost of waiting until the next time, and that leads to worse procrastination. Okay, and in this model, the consumer's gain from switching can be huge. Yet she doesn't switch because she expects to switch soon. And so this is in line with some of this motivating evidence that the empirical measure of the switching cost is super high. Even if the switching costs aren't high, this consumer may act as if she would have really high switching costs. Okay. And now what would be the policy approach, the typical policy approach in this type of market? Well, we would try to increase competition at the switching stage. Okay. And our theory says, well, this is not so easy to do, and it has an ambiguous effect. So if you're able to make switching actually easier, you lower the switching cost, that lowers prices. Okay, that makes it less tempting to procrastinate, so firms can't charge such a high initial price. Okay, adding more offers at each switching opportunity, in this market equilibrium, switching offers are already competitive. So even if there's multiple firms making the switching offers at each switching opportunity, that doesn't change anything. Okay, that doesn't have an effect. And worse, if you increase the frequency of offers, if the consumer foresees that future switching becomes more attractive, that increases current prices. Okay, and so what happens here is future competition or potential future competition decreases current competition. That's sort of the competition paradox. Okay, now at the moment you were assigned to your initial firm. So maybe it's your energy contract runs out and sort of the past, provider of your energy contract. But we also consider the case where you have a number of firms that compete to be the initial firm, right? And so in that sense, we have perfect competition or Bertrand competition at the initial stage. There's not one initial price that you see, but multiple initial prices. Okay, and if the ratio of initial firms to switching firms is sufficiently low, then nevertheless the exact same equilibrium survives. And let me try to, I would think this is surprising, and indeed, the message is not this is always going to happen. The message that we're trying to say is competition, the initial competition is very weak because the consumer thinks she's going to switch soon to a good offer anyhow, so it doesn't matter what you select today. And so how does this work in the equilibrium? The consumer thinks she'll switch. So a small price cut now is unattractive. If you give him a small price cut, the consumer thinks she'll switch at zero anyhow. And so since she switches anyhow, the small price cut really doesn't do anything. So to attract the consumer, you need to cut the price so low that the consumer thinks she's not going to switch. And so in the model, you have to cut the price so low that it's below the switching costs, right? Which would have been the measure of your market power in a classic model. And this drastic price cut is unprofitable for the firms. It makes more sense for the firms to gamble on charging a high price and be the initial firm, rather than cutting the price so steeply that you attract the consumer. So small price cuts don't work, and this condition ensures that large price cuts are unprofitable. And the interesting thing here is competition doesn't work exactly because the prices are too high. Once prices are forced to be low, competition does work. So it is the high prices that destroy competition. Okay, so that's sort of the mechanism in a nutshell. Of course, this was sort of a stark and simple model. And sort of one thing we often observe in the switching markets is that firms offer sign-up deals. Okay, so offer teaser deals to attract switching. So for example, you might get the service a certain amount of time at a lower price, or even for free, and then you pay the full price, right? So in the credit card industry, you often have no interest for a number of months. Now, in existing switching cost theories, such deals serve to return future profits to the consumer, and they're a great thing. Okay, and so to discuss this, I'll think about a variant of the previous model, where you have two firms, so it's a duopoly, and you have many switching opportunities. So with K, where are switching opportunities, you see the rivals offer. Consumers choose one out of these two offers at -1, and then the losing firm makes switching new offers at every opportunity. And here, firms can just charge a single price. The equilibrium is competitive. Really, basically, a firm can commit not to compete in the future because there's only a single price, and you're only going to see my price in the future if you go with the other firm. And by committing not to compete in the future, I don't have enough competition to get our procrastination market up and running. And so we now modify the game slightly. And now an offer consists out of a sign-up bonus and a unit price. Okay. And both the sign-up bonus and all monetary payment, sign-up bonus and unit price occur in the future whenever the consumer makes a switching decision. And the initial and the switching offers here are the same because the bonus is what differentiates the two. And we assume that the consumer can collect the bonus from a firm only once. So you can't sort of repeatedly go to the same firm and collect the bonus again and again. Okay. And sort of to understand kind of why competition here doesn't work. Suppose firms offer a high bonus. Okay, so it's a bonus that is at or above the switching costs. And suppose that the prices for the service are somewhat different between the firms. They're slightly different. Then the consumer takes and sticks with the more expensive deal. Okay, so the consumer will freely initially choose the worst deal. And the logic is, well, because the bonus is greater than the switching cost, the consumer plans to cycle through the bonuses. She wants to collect both bonuses. So when contemplating the bonuses, the order doesn't matter. As long as you collect both of them, it doesn't matter in which order you collect them. Okay. But what's important is you want to end up with the cheaper deal. You want to pay the lower unit price at the end. So you're going to start by taking the more expensive deal and then switching to the cheaper deal, or that's your plan, then switching to the cheaper deal. But after that, if the prices aren't too different, you're just going to be procrastinating on switching. Okay. So the consumers, again, strictly prefers the more expensive deal. And she does so exactly because it's more expensive, because at the end of the day, after having switched, she wants to end up with the cheaper deal. And, to get this mechanism running, bonuses play a crucial role. Absent bonuses, this would not happen. And sort of, this is not the full characterization of the equilibrium and all possible deviations. But you can see that if the consumer chooses a worse deal, that's bad news for competition. And indeed, in this model, it kills initial competition completely. Okay. Now, let me also briefly mention another possible extension, right? So far, this was like an essential service. The consumer needs the service. And so now I want to think about markets where there's an option to cancel. And suppose the consumer can go without the service now, but she has a value V per unit of time for the service. Okay, you can cancel the service at every switching opportunity. And when you do so, you can keep the bonus. Taking up, switching, or canceling a contract all cost S. Okay. Now, assume the bonus is fixed at some level that's greater than the switching cost, but not too high. And M is a large integer, just sort of indulge me on this for the sake of the presentation. Then there's a duopoly equilibrium, when you have two firms with higher prices than under monopoly, and in which you charge more than the consumer's value for the product. Okay, so what goes on? Well, the logic is reasonably simple. Suppose you're a monopolist. Okay, now you could either sort of try and charge V, but you can actually do better. You can get the consumer to sign up for the bonus. You charge them a bonus to sign up, and then to procrastinate cancel. And so by writing this tricky contract, you can get a little more money out of the consumer. Okay. With duopoly, you basically do the same, but you can charge an even higher price. And the reason is that in duopoly, when the consumer cancels my contract, she wants to, cancel my contract, take the contract up of the competitor to cancel that later. So she wants to do more things. That's more immediate costs. And that makes sort of procrastination worse. So it makes it sort of more tempting to wait till tomorrow to do this. And if procrastination is worse, then you can charge a higher price. And again, sort of competition doesn't ensure to mitigate this problem, right? And why does competition not work here? Small price cuts, again, are unattractive because prices are way too high. If you cut your price a little bit, the consumer still plans to do exactly the same thing and cancel and so on. So to attract the consumer, you're gonna still have to do large price cuts, and conditions in the paper then make sure that those are too steep to be profitable. Okay, so what did I try to convey in this 20 minutes? Well, in this paper, we argued that you shouldn't think of procrastination just as psychological switching costs. The logic of markets with procrastination is different, and they're more serious impediment to competition. Okay, they really competition even already at the initial stage, because it's not important for the consumer to select a really good deal initially. So it has its own logic. Because the consumer thinks she'll behave optimally in the future, it's not important to get best offer at the beginning. So you get no, in our paper here, no, or we discuss in the paper a bunch of variants where you get very weak initial competition. And so a little bit of product differentiation or so on kills initial competition. So what does this imply for policy? Well, of course, anything that mitigates procrastination is great. But that seems very hard, right? Getting the consumers to become a different person and not procrastinate is hard. Of course, making switching very easy is a good idea. And so we should maybe look at other solutions, e.g. managed switching. And so, a nice discussion by Paul Josko on following the deregulation of the energy market in the US and the somewhat sort of disappointment to IO economists that it didn't work as well as we planned. And many things going on, but one of them was sort of that consumers failed to switch to better deals, except for Ohio. And what was the difference in Ohio? In Ohio, by default, the municipalities purchase power on behalf of consumers from the cheapest supplier. So you could choose a different supplier, but if you didn't do an active choice, someone put you on the cheapest deal by default. And that worked much better than other markets. And with that, let me finish. I already see Morten, so I'm out of time.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was really fascinating. Again, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. Meanwhile, we'll move on to our last speaker, which is David Laibson. So David, nudges are not enough. The floor is yours.
Thanks to the organizers for inviting us to join the program. Let me share my screen. Great. Okay, so this is joint work with John Bashairs, James Choi, and Bridget Madrian. And we're trying to think about nudges as a policy lever. And as everyone, I think, probably in this conference knows, that there are many nudges that change behavior in a highly cost-effective way. You get some behavior change, maybe it's small, and you get that at almost zero cost. So nudges have been a very popular policy remedy. But we're going to kind of argue in today's talk that there are some problems in the nudge world. The most acclaimed nudge, auto-enrollment in retirement savings, we're going to show has very small effects on behavior over the long run, at least in the US, where you can withdraw your balances from these accounts. So that this solution really isn't a solution to a low savings rate. It's a kind of small step in the right direction, a very small step, as you'll see. In addition, I'm going to argue that many nudges have large short-run proximate or proxy effects, but small or even non-existent true effects, arguing that if we really want to think about the efficacy of nudges, we want to track their consequences over the long run. And we'll see two examples today where the short-run effects look great, but the long-run effects are very disappointing. Not perverse, but just either zero or small. I want to begin with automatic savings, this kind of classical example of a nudge success. Just to remind everyone, automatic enrollment is the idea that if you don't opt out, then you begin automatically saving at a default contribution and at a default asset allocation. In the US, we also have something called default automatic escalation. And here, this can be simultaneously implemented with automatic enrollment. With default automatic escalation, if you don't opt out, then not only are you saving, but your savings rate automatically rises over time. There's been a lot of papers praising these different approaches. In one paper by Benartzi and Thaler in 2013, they calculate that the effect of automatic escalation is to increase, this is the causal effect, to increase savings for employees by $1,800 per year per employee. What we're going to argue is that when you track these policies over the long run, you find much, much smaller effects. We're going to argue that if you think about a 5-year window, the cumulative effect of these auto programs is to increase balances by less than $1,000, maybe by much less than $1,000. So that's less than $200 per year. So the effects that we're going to show you are an order of magnitude smaller than what has been claimed in the earlier literature. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take administrative data from retirement savings plans. In the US, they're called 401k plans. We're using data from a generous provider, Alight Solutions. We're going to be studying 23 companies that introduced auto policies only for new hires going forward, but not for hires already at the company. So we've got a natural experiment, a treatment group, the people that were hired after the introduction of the policy, and a control group, the people that were hired just before the introduction of the policy. We'll actually use a 180-day bandwidth on either side of the policy introduction date and a triangle kernel. This is a regression discontinuity approach using the hire date as the running variable, and obviously comparing people hired just before and just after the hire date. Those just before are not treated, those just after are treated, and will be standard error clustering at the week of hire. So quickly, a review of the 401k system, which is of course a US system, but there's analogs around the world. It's a tax-advantaged retirement savings account. It's funded by payroll deduction. The employee chooses the contribution rate. While you're employed at your employer with this particular plan, you can only withdraw under limited hardship circumstances. But once you leave the employer, once you separate, you can withdraw money from these accounts for any reason. And this feature is a kind of libertarian approach, will give you flexibility. In the UK, you don't have this. And kudos to the UK for not having that. It turns out that this ability to withdraw these funds in the US is going to dramatically reduce their efficacy, or reduce the efficacy of these retirement savings programs. When you separate from a firm, you can either make a withdrawal to cash, or you can roll over the money into another 401k or into an individual retirement account. Now, those rollovers are good news. It's the withdrawals that go to cash that are the bad news. That's where you're seeing money leaving these systems and hence not being available for retirement. Here's our sample. We've got 26 firms, and they're in different categories in terms of the actual experiment that we're able to study. The first 13 are firms that introduced auto enrollment, but did not introduce default automatic escalation. So there's a fixed contribution rate that represents the new program. There's a second set of firms where they introduce auto enrollment and default auto escalation. So both auto features are being introduced simultaneously in the second set of firms. And then there's a third set of firms where the firm already has pre-existing auto enrollment and is introducing default auto escalation on top of the pre-existing auto enrollment. And across these three firms, we've got about 100,000 employees who are in this 180-day bandwidth kernel. So those are the people that we're essentially studying to identify the effects of these interventions. Here's the bottom line, and I'll explain why the results are so disappointing. This is the effect on balances as we accumulate either over 1 year or as we accumulate over 5 years. And you can see here that whether you look at the 1-year horizon in the dark gray or the 5-year horizon in the lighter gray, you see that these effects are relatively modest. And again, these are cumulative effects. So if it's $1,000 of additional balances over 5 years, that's $200 of savings per year. And if you think about a lifetime effect, well, we're talking about 40 years of working life. So we might be talking about $8,000 of lifetime additional savings. These are modest effects. At the 1-year horizon, just to even give you an example, here we're seeing an effect of about $150. And at the 5-year horizon, here we're seeing an effect of about $900. And these effects are modest of these auto features across all 3 categories of auto features. In this first group here, we're looking at auto enrollment without default auto escalation. In the second group here, we're looking at auto enrollment with default auto escalation. And in the final group, we're looking at just the introduction of default auto escalation on top of a pre-existing program of default auto enrollment. And I'm showing you here the causal effect using this regression discontinuity approach of introducing the new feature. And as you can see, wherever you look, the effects are very modest. And here I'm including rollovers as part of the savings effect. So if you accumulate funds inside these firms and then roll them over to another retirement savings plan, that counts in these numbers. So we're not losing track of those rollovers. We're incorporating them and counting them as part of the causal effect. So even with rollovers included, the effects are modest. Now, you might wonder, how has this literature been so optimistic about the effects of these programs when you see the results on that previous slide? And the answer is, at tenure of 1 year, there are large effects, especially on participation. So what is a positive contribution rate? It means that you're participating. And here we're looking at all employees in the firm. So active employees means employees that are employed at a particular horizon. And you can see here at 1 year of tenure, the causal effect of introducing these auto features can be very large. The causal effect of introducing auto enrollment in our firms is about a 30% increase in the enrollment rates at 1 year of tenure. The causal effect of introducing auto enrollment and auto escalation at 1 year horizon is about a 45% increase in the participation rate. But you'll notice that these causal effects get a lot smaller as we move to the 5-year window in light gray. And that's because people are not just passive entities that sit there and do nothing over the years of employment. They actually enroll themselves and they catch up. And so the causal effect at 5 years is either indistinguishable from 0 here and here, or slightly greater than 0 here. But now we're seeing much smaller causal effects. So the bottom line is that there's big effects in the short run, and then there's a lot of catch up because people are not completely passive. They eventually get around to it. They procrastinate, but not forever. And that's why these apparent successes at 1 year become much mitigated successes over longer horizons. Another important channel that undoes the effects of these programs is leakage when people separate from a firm. So here we're accumulating leakage during the first 5 years of employment. And you can see here that the leakage rate for people with very small accounts down here, less than 1,000, is approximately 80 to 100%. So almost all the funds are leaking when people separate from these employers. And by leaking, I mean going out of the retirement savings system altogether, not going to an IRA, but going to cash and getting presumably spent. Even accounts with relatively large balances, have high rates of leakage. So you see here that while leakage is super high for low accounts, it's even very meaningful for large accounts. So leakage is another powerful force that's undermining wealth accumulation. And the nice thing is that in the UK, this kind of leakage is not allowed. So that's one of the reasons why your automatic enrollment program works better than ours. So to summarize this first set of observations, in the US, auto savings is an order of magnitude less effective than first believed. The cumulative effect is less than $1,000 during the first 5 years after hire. There are 3 critical reasons why we're getting these modest effects. First, employees are not passive. They frequently adjust their contribution rate, and by the time you get out to 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they've caught up to the auto-enrolled employees who were automatically entered into the program. So those who are not auto-enrolled enroll themselves. Secondly, there's a lot of movement in the US labor market. A lot of employees leave the company in the first 5 years, and that means that things like auto escalation never succeed in pushing them to the very high savings rates because they're out of firm 1 and moving to firm 2 before they get the benefit of the auto escalation to the very high savings rates. And finally, we saw that there were a lot of withdrawals when people separate from a firm. So particularly among low-income workers, who are the workers that are most powerfully affected by auto policies, when they separate, they tend to leak, and the money that was accumulated tends to vanish from the retirement savings system. Now, I want to tell you about one other example in the 6 minutes I've got remaining. This is a UK example of another nudge that looks like it succeeds, but actually in the long run is another example of an unsuccessful or limited successful nudge. This is joint work with Paul Adams, Ben Goodman-Kenny, Lucy Hayes, Stephen Hunt, and Neil Stewart. And this is research that was collaboratively executed with the Financial Conduct Authority. Here we're studying about 40,000 UK credit cards that were newly issued in 2017. And we're studying cardholders who are attempting to set up an automatic payment, and they're being randomized into a control and treatment group as they come to the launch pad on the web to set up their automatic payment. What we're trying to do is to get them to not set up an automatic payment that is just the minimum payment. Here's the screen they see when they get to the launch page. We don't want them to set up this minimum payment because the minimum payment has them pay back their balance at a rate of 1% of the balance per month. So they end up paying back very little if that's their automatic payment. We'd rather they set up a automatic payment that pays the full statement amount or an automatic payment that pays a healthy fixed amount that is far in excess of the minimum payment. So we'd like to see households choosing one of these 2 options. So in our control group, people see all 3 options on the launch page. We take that first option off of the launch page for our treatment group. And so our treatment group sees only these 2 options on the launch page. Either pick an amount that is fixed, or ideally pick an amount that is the full payment of your credit card debt each month. And it looks like it's a huge success. If you look at the control group and you think about the automatic minimum category, meaning having set up an automatic payment that is the minimum amount that you're required to pay, we see in the control group, 37% of the individuals in this study, again, randomized to control and treatment, 37% are picking the automatic minimum payment, but in the treatment group, that falls to only 9.6%. So superficially, it looks like a great success. However, if you actually follow these people over the next year, you find that there's no effect on the more important outcomes that we actually care about. What I showed you on the previous slide was just the kind of proximate intermediate measure, but the real thing we care about is how much they're borrowing, how much they're spending. When we look at those things, total debt repayments, credit card spend, borrowing costs, or debt net of payments, wherever we look at the real economic variables that matter, we see no effect. Now, how can that be? When we see such a big effect on this proximate variable, the propensity to use the automatic minimum payment feature, well, the answer is that these consumers that are getting nudged out of automatic minimum payments tend to pick small automatic fixed payments. They don't check the box, by and large, pay everything in full. They check the box, make a very small automatic fixed payment. It's bigger than the minimum, but it's not much bigger than the minimum. Moreover, our treatment causes people to reduce the value of their ad hoc manual payments. And when you put these two effects together, you find that the net effect is that our treatment, though apparently successful, is in fact not successful in the long run in affecting the variables that we care about. So let me conclude now. These are two examples from a nascent literature finding that some nudges work less well than initially believed. Indeed, many nudges work less well than initially believed. The long run true effects tend to be smaller than the short run proximate effects. And you can kind of intuit that with an example. If I kind of nudge you to eat less at lunch, you're gonna go home hungrier and snack more and maybe eat more at dinner. So even though I got your calories down at lunch, maybe as a consequence, your calories are up in the afternoon and evening, and the net effect, if I just followed you over the whole day, is much smaller than the effect I would measure during lunch. There are these powerful behavioral forces that cause people to kind of offset what we're trying to achieve through these nudges. So to highlight the two examples that I discussed today, first I discussed the auto feature nudge and retirement savings. And there, the long run true effect was a very small increase in retirement savings. We saw big short run proximate effects, which was a big increase in participation in the first year of tenure caused by automatic enrollment, but that did not translate into a big long run effect. Indeed, the long run effects were pretty modest. I also talked about a nudge conducted with the Financial Conduct Authority that was an anti-minimum payment nudge in the credit card domain. And here again, we saw very small, indeed non-existent long-run true effects, essentially no change in their credit card debt and their credit card spend, but very promising and misleading short-run proximate effects. We did get people to stop using the automatic minimum payment feature, but we didn't get the long-run meaningful effects we were hoping to achieve. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Another really exciting paper. So now we move on to the discussant, Kate Collyer. Before then, let me just again encourage you to put questions in the Q&A box. If I said chat box, that's not actually available to you, but the Q&A box, if you would please use that.
How you do that? Because it doesn't seem to allow. Well, there's only one person who's managed to get into there, and I certainly can't.
That's beyond my pay grade to be able to.
I click on Q&A.
Yeah.
Bob, we as panelists, we don't have access to the Q&A, but we can talk to each other through chat. So
Okay,
feel free to initiate something through that.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter. There was an explanation. Okay, over to you.
Thank you. I'm glad you didn't ask me to explain the technical side of things. That would have been way beyond me. Thank you, Morten, and thank you for inviting me to join this session. I have to say I really enjoyed these papers, and I think there's really a lot here for us to discuss. I think each of these papers shows a different aspect of an exciting development for us in behavioural economics, and gives us better insights and understanding that as a regulator and for competition authorities that we can use to better understand what's going on in markets and to help us to improve our remedy design. So I've got a few minutes. There are a few things that I wanted to do. I've got some questions that I'd like to ask. I'd also like to look across to draw on policy experience of some of the questions and the insights that emerge from these papers and to try and draw those out. And then just to wrap it all together, I will try to draw it together and sort of get some takeaways from what we should learn from this research altogether. So what do these papers tell us about how we should approach markets and demand-side remedies? I'll take each of the papers in turn, starting with the work on procrastination markets. So that work tells us that, well, maybe switching markets don't work well, and even in markets that look on the face of it to be quite competitive with lots of firms present. The model shows us how consumer switching just can't sometimes be relied upon to discipline markets. And when consumers aren't responding to quite big differences in the prices that they're offered, that there may be some problems that we need to consider in terms of the underlying procrastination issues. Now, at the moment in the UK, we're having quite a lively debate about loyalty penalties. And I think this work on procrastination market has some potentially important read across and insights for how we think about those markets. So at the FCA, we've recently finished a market study into general insurance pricing practices. And we used a lot of behavioural insights and work to really inform that work. We find a price walking problem in those markets, so a loyalty penalty where consumers are putting up with price increases year after year after year rather than switching. And there, the work that we did showed that there were, quite significant gains from switching that people weren't taking advantage of, and that there were some important behavioural traits that were really largely responsible for that. So in this paper, Paul identifies procrastination due to the time and consistent preferences as the reason for that problem emerging in that model. In general insurance, I think we found a different driver of why switching wasn't working well. So there it was the problem of trust being misplaced, so consumers trusting that their insurer would give them a good deal, and that leading to the inertia. But I do think that call to look at procrastination and to understand that as a potential driver of low switching in markets is really important. So the paper concludes and suggests that relying on consumer engagement to achieve low prices in switching markets could be extremely difficult. And I'll be really interested to hear the debate around the example from the Ohio energy market. I've heard that in other contexts, and I'd really be interested to hear others' views on what we should draw from that example. I think it's an important one. But I think that overall conclusion that perhaps we can't always rely on consumer engagement also accords with our experience in general insurance. So we looked in that example at different ways to try and address the problems. And to start with, we did try a behavioural remedy that was looking to encourage switching. It was modestly successful, and it did reduce the size of premium increases on average, but it didn't address that loyalty penalty fully. So in that example, we concluded that the policy answer wasn't that you just facilitate more switching, but that it required an intervention that didn't rely solely on consumer action. So we've recently put in place a ban on price walking alongside other measures that look to try to reduce the effort of cost switching. So it'll be interesting to see the evaluation and the impact of that and see how it accords with some of the conclusions from this paper. Before I move on, I just had one comment. In this model, so the marketing information is feeding into consumers' beliefs that they will switch, and that encourages the procrastination that we see. And then the more firms there are, the more marketing, and then the more procrastination. And I, for one, suspect that the first part of that accords with, well, personally, my own experience, but also kind of a more general experience. But I'd be really keen to know what examples or evidence we have about the second part of it and the relationship between marketing and procrastination. Then the second paper then, so I'm not taking these in the right order, so I apologise for that. The second paper I wanted to turn to then is the paper on the manipulation of mislaid priorities, and importantly, the role of disclosure remedies. So again, this is a different set of questions, but really important ones. We often use disclosure regimes, I think, in lots of different markets, particularly financial services. And so the conclusion that those need to be looked at very carefully, and indeed the provocative statement that poorly designed disclosure mandates can also be manipulative, I think deserves our full attention. I would posit that in financial services, at least, we see the situation of complements quite frequently. I think you can probably argue that for many financial products, the overall quality is affected by the quality of all of the characteristics. And perhaps like the example in the paper where I think it was holidays, where all of the different dimensions of your holiday package matter, and none more perhaps than the other. But I think that work has some direct application, certainly to some work we're doing at the moment. I thought it might just be worth sharing some recent work we've been doing on testing risk warnings in consumer investments. So we've been piloting some work that looks at warnings for high risk investments, and we've found there that they lead to kind of a better understanding of the risk associated with the product. And that they also that the warnings also had an effect on people's investment decisions. So the people who were subject to that particular treatment were slightly less likely to choose high risk investments, things like mini bonds and crypto assets, than they were safe assets. So in that parallel to the example that was discussed, the new risk warnings kind of flag the low dimension of quality. So that's the risk of losing all your money, and make that more salient than it would have been in the old approach. And we're working on other warnings regimes for this sector. So I think the proposals in this paper are that salience of certain points needs to be really carefully thought about, really does chime. And the finding, the really crucial finding, that we need to really think carefully about the dimensions of quality and the relationship of those is an important one, I think, for all of us to be alert to, particularly when those dimensions may be substitutes. And I'd be particularly keen and interested to hear of examples of dimensions that are substitutes and what experience we have of those. So then the third paper is on the modest long run effects from nudges. And again, a really, really interesting and important point, particularly given how much we may be coming to rely on nudges. And the paper finds that carefully constructed and carefully placed nudges can have positive effects. And I think that accords with the experience of regulators and competition authorities as well. And certainly in financial services, we've done some recent work looking at nudges in pawnbroking, which have been pretty successful, and suggest that that there is an impact there that's of an order of magnitude that we hope persists into the long run. But the paper also suggests that the long run effects might be quite modest. So, and indeed that they might be quite a lot smaller than the short run effects that we might be measuring in some of our evaluation work. And then in the paper goes on to argue that maybe we should be thinking about more strongly interventionist approaches in some cases. Now, I think, as regulators, our focus is on outcomes, and we need to be really careful to make sure that our interventions are proportionate. But on balance, I think I agree that if there is significant harm to consumers and nudges are just not having the desired impact, then there may be occasions when a stronger approach may be needed. And indeed, going back to my earlier example from general insurance and pricing practices there, we reached that conclusion. It was clear from our earlier work that nudges weren't fully solving the problem, and so we did take, in that case, a more interventionist approach. So the paper concludes then that nudges should be rigorously tested before implementation and then evaluated afterwards to make sure they're effective. And it's very hard to disagree with that. I think that's a good practice that we should all be putting into place. I think the interesting dimension of this is that longer term evaluation and making sure that what we're seeing isn't just a short term reaction that then kind of peters out over the longer run. So the first insight from this then is we should keep evaluating our interventions, and that we shouldn't expect any one intervention to be a silver bullet. And I think I agree with that. The other one I just wanted to flag, the other important insight from this that I took at least, was that consumers adapt and re-optimize, and it comes through really nicely in the last example from the work with the FCA. And the takeaway for me from that is we may be able to use nudges to influence consumer behaviour over one dimension, but it doesn't necessarily mean we can change the outcome. And given that we're interested in changing outcomes, I think that's a really important finding. I don't have the answers on how we deal with that, but I thought it's worth thinking about whether there might be some lessons and thinking that we could learn from the approaches that are taken in other disciplines. So just as behavioural economics incorporates thinking from psychology and neuroscience, I do wonder if we shouldn't also look to something like systems thinking to help us better capture some of the complexity of human behaviour. So I'll wrap it up there. Let me just finish though with two kind of overarching questions that I'd be keen to hear thoughts from. Firstly, when do we think that stronger interventions are needed over nudges? How can we make sure we're getting that right? And then secondly, do we need to get better at capturing the complexity of human behaviour? And if so, how should we go about doing that?
Okay, thank you very much. Before we turn to the question in the Q&A box and in the chat box from the delegates, I'll just invite each of the three speakers to just respond to anything you would like to respond to in what Kate has said. So if we start in reverse order with David, if you have anything briefly you want to respond.
No, thanks, Kate. Those were great comments.
Okay, Paul.
So maybe just briefly, I mean, I thought it was really interesting that the FCA now regulates the general insurance contracts, and in particular, it sort of rules out price walking. In the paper, we speculate a little bit that to understand the finer price patterns, right? So in the energy market, you jump to the standard default tariff and how the prices increase over time for the loyalty penalty. That probably depends on what psychological model drives procrastination. We don't have anything to say why it would be one or the other in a different market, but sort of limited attention could be very important. If you increase it only a little bit, then people don't notice so easily. And I think that is a good suspicion for the price walking. That'd be great paper. I was really intrigued that you ban it, because in the classic model, that means I'm going to have less incentives to make an aggressive initial offer because it's tight, no? And so I would have expected that IO economists are all over your back, because that's the one thing that our classic model says that you should not do, because it makes an effect. And so, our model is somewhat of a defense. At least if you believe there is no initial competition, then you're home free. But it was a bold move, and so I was very intrigued, and I'd be really intrigued to see what happens in the long run. And then you said policy-wise, I mean, if switching markets don't really work, then, in the electricity market, I think it's very easy. I don't understand what the retail market is meant to achieve. I understand competition in generation, then we have monopoly in the net. And then the retail market, why not choose the cheapest deal on behalf of the consumer with an auction design? So there, I think we really should question whether we're in the right market design, but that's meant to be provocative, and I throw that out to everyone.
Okay, Oren.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Kate. This was great. And let me just kind of take on your invitation. You wanted to hear more about markets with kind of substitutes, or maybe even to phrase this more generally, what are the potential situations where we think the disclosure regulation can be harmful, namely providing consumers with information that is less important to them and maybe crowding out information that is more important. So just two quick examples that we kind of briefly mentioned, but of course more study is required. So in the food context, in the US, you have to put these GMO warnings. My sense is that for many customers, whether there is GMO or not GMO is not the most important information, and we're worried that might crowd out things that are more important to consumers. Another example from Europe has to do with privacy and GDPR. So our sense is that we have a lot of these, important GDPR, very salient GDPR warnings. They might crowd out other information about the service, the website, that might be more important to some of these consumers. So these are just some thoughts off the top of my head.
Super, thank you very much. Now, just looking at the Q&A, the current front runner is a question from Steve Kelkinson, and let me just read it. It's a question, I think, for David, which is, could you talk more about whether these failed nudges are just outliers, or is the suggestion that nudging really isn't a good idea at all? And I guess if I could just add something to that, which is, what does it say? I guess a lot of the evidence we have is very short run, and how much more evidence do we need on the long run efficacy of some of these interventions?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And my general perspective is that nudges are great as long as we understand what we're getting from the nudges. By and large, we're getting small effects at a spectacularly low social cost. So if I can do that, then I want nudges. I want to test them. I think Kate's point and the general strategy in the UK at the FCA, at the Behavioral Insights team of doing RCTs and testing and trying to understand how things are working, that's fantastic. And by and large, I think we're going to find that nudges have an important role to play, but they're not going to solve our large social problems. They're going to move the needle a little tiny bit in the right direction. And I just hope that we keep that in mind and keep ourselves open to more aggressive strategies that may move the needle even further. I think we should keep nudges, and I think we should supplement them with other policies that can move the needle more.
Thank you. There's also in the,